Hey guys, welcome to our second episode in our genetics series. If you haven't seen episode 1, definitely check that out by hitting the link somewhere here. Today's video we're going to be looking at the key terms, some of the real key terms in genetics, including dominant, recessive, homozygous, heterozygous. What the hell do they all mean? We're going to be looking at that in greater detail in today's episode, so let's get to it. So today, guys, we're going to look at some of the key scientific language or key terms in genetics which refer to how genetics works and helps us understand how genetics and inheritance work. Last episode, we looked at inheritance between a male and a female during sexual reproduction, and we looked at a key term in that video, allele, which were, if we remember correctly, where you have two different versions of the same gene, or an allele is a variation or a different version of the same gene, and we call them alleles. Today we're looking at 6 terms in total, and we're going to start with something a little bit more basic and then progress as we go forward. So the first 2 terms I want to talk about are what we call genotype and phenotype. So they sound kind of complicated, but if we look at the actual terms, here we have the prefix gene, and this gives a clue as to what it's actually saying. So if we quickly bring back and we really quickly sketch down in this corner that example we used last video, or the last episode, where we had a male and a male and a female, and we had the female with blue eyes, or 2 copies of the blue-eyed gene, and male with 2 copies of the brown-eyed gene, where they bred together and they made an offspring. They made an offspring which had 1 copy of the blue-eyed gene and 1 copy of the brown-eyed gene, or 1 blue allele and 1 brown allele. Now, if you remember in that video when we talked about what genes do and we said they code for characteristics, I mentioned that some genes you can see, such as eye color, and some genes you cannot see, which means things like, and I gave the example of blood type. Now, the genotype is the genes that the organism is carrying. So, in genetics generally, we tend to give different letters for different genes, or different versions of different alleles, for example. And those letters are based on 2 other terms, which we'll get to in a minute. So if we, for right now, say that the blue copy of the blue-eyed gene, or the gene that codes for blue eyes, if we represent that as little b, and for the brown we represent that as big B, we can see that for the genotype for the female, the genes the female is carrying, right, are little b, because she's got 2 copies of that blue-eyed gene. The male, on the other hand, has 2 copies of the brown-eyed gene, which we've given the letter capital B to. So the genotype, the genes the male is carrying, are big B, big B. The offspring, on the other hand, it's inherited 1 blue from mum, so little b. So if we just say, if we represent this as let's actually write offspring. So the offspring in this case would have 1 little b from mum and 1 big B from dad. Now, if you look here, this actually, if we were just to look at this doesn't tell you what the visual characteristic of that organism is. We know it's genes. We know this girl has, or this female has, a little b. We know the male has a capital B, and we know that the offspring has a little b, capital B, but that doesn't tell us anything about the visual characteristics of the organisms. That's where, so the genotype are the genes, okay? The genes carried by a particular organism. Whereas the phenotype is the visual manifestation of the genes. Okay, so what do we visually see What is the visual manifestation? What can we visually see in terms of the genes that the organisms are carrying? Now, we know that the female in this case was little b, and we know from here that she has blue eyes. Okay. We also know that the male, we know his genotype is capital B, and we know that that B stands for brown eyes. So we know, and we said before, that the dad, or the male in this case, has brown eyes. But what of the offspring? Now, this is where the next key term comes in, and we can work out what the offspring's gene or phenotype is based on what these genes actually do. So the example we gave was the blue allele, we gave the letter little b to, and the brown allele, we gave the letter capital B2. And I did say that there was a reason behind this and why we give them different uppercase and lowercase letters, and we're about to explain that now. So there are 4 terms, and I'm going to go slow, but there are 4 terms here that we need to understand. The first is dominant and recessive. So dominant and recessive genes, automatically you think of dominant as being something stronger. So a dominant gene in this case is actually the brown allele, which we gave that larger uppercase letter to, the capital B2, which represents the dominant, the stronger version of the gene. The recessive in this case was the blue, and that's why we gave it a lowercase b, to represent the fact that it is recessive. Now, dominant and recessive goes a little bit further than just being a strong gene and a little gene. If you had 2 dominant genes together, so if we had an organism with 2 capital B's, you would expect it to be pretty even, right? But this one couldn't overpower this one, and this one couldn't overpower that one. That would be the same with the recessive. So if we had 2 copies of the recessive gene, the recessive gene would show neither are stronger than the other. The interesting thing comes when you add a recessive gene and a dominant gene together. So when they're together, present in the same organism, we have a capital B and a little b in this case, and because the brown eye in this case is dominant, it will actually overpower the recessive gene. So what will happen is when we're talking about genotype, here we have big B, little b, big B, little b. So we can see what the genotypes are, but the phenotypes in this case, if the 2 copies are brown, neither will win. So the phenotype, or the visual characteristic you will see here, is brown eyes, right? Now here you will see that with 2 lowercase b's in the recessive's case, if you have a 2 lowercase b's, 2 recessives together, neither will overpower each other. So the phenotype, the visual characteristic, will be, oh, paper's running away, blue eyes. However, when you have them mixed together in a particular organism, because the dominant gene dominates in a sense, or is stronger than the recessive, it masks that recessive gene. So what we would see, the visual phenotype would not be 1 brown, 1 blue, it would actually just be brown eyes. And that means you can see here that in order for a recessive gene to be visual, in order for it to have a phenotype or a visual manifestation, you need to have an organism which has 2 copies of that same recessive gene. Whereas in terms of the brown eyes with dominant, the organism could either have 2 copies of the same gene, or it could have 1 copy of the dominant gene, 1 copy of the recessive gene, but it would still only show that dominant gene. And this is where we can now bring in our last 2 terms, which are homozygous and heterozygous. And homozygous, which would be these 2, would be a gene or an organism that has 2 of the same, or 2 of the same, let's see about that. So 2 of the same genes, actually. 2 of the same genes. So you could say that in terms of homozygous, that would be a homozygous organism, and that would be a homozygous organism. Whereas heterozygous means 2 different genes. And that comes from the prefix hetero, and same comes from homo. Now zygous is actually comes from the term zygote, which is a fertilized egg. So once an egg becomes fertilized in any organism, whether it's humans or otherwise, when sexual reproduction creates a fertilized egg, we call that a zygote. So that's what the zygos comes from here. The homo means 2 of the same. Hetero means 2 different genes within an organism, within a fertilized embryo. And in this case, if we look carefully, you can quite easily identify that, get a slightly different color here so we can see the difference. You can see that this organism right here is heterozygous. Okay, so we have 2 different versions of the same gene. So to really quickly recap, we looked at genotype and phenotype, which were genotype was the, bring her back, genotype being the genes present in an organism, so in this case represented by letters, and the phenotype being the visual manifestation of the genes, blue eyes or brown eyes. And we can now work out that this offspring, because of its genotype, little b, big B, or big B, little b, doesn't matter which way around it goes, you can tell that that dominant big B is going to mask the little b. In this case, the brown is going to mask the blue. So the offspring, in fact, has brown eyes. And we looked at the fact that dominant is a gene where only 1 copy is actually needed. It's a stronger gene. It's where only 1 copy of that gene is required for us to visually see that gene manifest. Whereas recessive is almost a subservient or less dominant, weaker gene, which requires 2 copies in order to manifest as a visual characteristic. And we said that the terms given to an organism with 2 of the same gene, 2 of the same alleles, is homozygous, and an organism with 2 different copies of the same gene or 2 different alleles is called heterozygous. Right guys, we really hope you enjoyed that second episode in our genetic series. Hopefully you learned a little bit more. Our 3rd episode will be out soon, so keep an eye out for that. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. It supports us so much and we love you guys. Leave a comment down in the comment section below. And until the next episode guys, we'll see you then. Bye.